This week in the Philippine documentaries, we will tackle about the volatile dictatorship of the Japanese that the Philippines faced a long time ago. So, how exactly did the Japanese colonization started back in the old days? A brief history of the colonization. On the 18th of December 1941, Japanese forces invaded the Philippines in a sneak attack on military installations in Luzon. The Japanese troops landed at the Lingayen Gulf on December 22, 1941 and advanced across central Luzon towards Manila. The Japanese occupied the Philippines for over 3 years until Japan surrendered. Although the 3 years of Japanese occupation were a bit short, Japan was also able to leave influences and had great impacts in which the Filipinos started to apply and practice in their daily lives.
Effects of the Japanese occupation. Before the invasion, Manila was considered to be a place to be for foreigners. The streets were clean, there were no squatters, and the train would arrive on time. During the invasion, 70% of the infrastructures were damaged, which resulted in the country having a hard time picking itself up again. Manila then has become a haven for criminals and squatters.
Over the 3 years of Japanese colonization in the country, the Filipinos suffered greatly in the atrocities done by the Japanese. 100,000 Filipinos lost their lives during the month of February 1945 alone. Both Filipinos and Americans were greatly punished for any acts against the Japanese soldiers and to the government, which then resulted in the taking out of the freedom of expression of both Filipinos and Americans. Rape, which was common to women, and slavery were also rampant during the colonization of the Japanese. Another devastating effect of the invasion was that it ruined the moral fiber of Filipinos to be kind and helpful to everyone, and in being honest and law-abiding citizens. Japanese colonization gave birth to the mentality of staying alive at all costs, even if it meant robbing or cheating on fellow Filipinos. Since thieving was pretty rampant at the time, the Japanese called the Filipinos Dorobos, which meant thieves. The Dorobo mentality carried over to the Liberation era and the Independence era, since the government could not provide adequate jobs and education for everyone.
Influences of the Japanese occupation. To start this with, what were some of the influences that the Japanese gave to the Philippines? Though before all of this actually, we all know that the Filipinos, the Japanese, and the Americans have their own unique culture of their own terms. The Filipino-American relationship by means of the relationship of colonization, and then on the other hand, we have the Japan-American relationship, which is not actually good, and is correlated by means of war. I mean, this is basically in the setting and in the context of World War II era, in where Japan and America are in polar opposite sides. After the Americans colonized the country, the Japanese came to the Philippines for 3 years and taught us to use the Nippongo language instead of using the English language, which was brought upon by the Americans. The Japanese also introduced to us the importance of basic education, provided with a curriculum that promotes our vocational skills for us to develop our love for working. The Filipino culture would not have existed today if it wasn't for the Japanese, because they were the ones who have encouraged the Filipinos to advocate and enrich their culture. Now moving on, how did the Japanese influence Filipinos' creativity in the aspect of arts? The Japanese, as part of the colonization process, there's always the means of pushing their own culture towards us, and then in this case it's the art paintings as well. It's in that influence. During the Japanese era, Filipinos' creativity and the science and art paintings depicted the wartime scenes and propaganda of the Japanese during their settlement in the Philippines. Filipino sculpture establishes indigenizing and orientalizing masterpieces, an example of which is the statue of bronze artwork dubbed Filipino Comfort Women. The bonsai is the art of growing small trees and shrubs in small, shallow pots. And the Japanese introduced bonsai to the Filipinos, where it is a fascinating art form that combines horticultural and Asian aesthetics in a unique way. I mean, of course, it's unique since bonsai is obviously not a common plant to see, because again, it's one of the smallest things that are easy to grow and is really decorative in comparison to majority of the trees. These bonsai can be seen in houses, restaurants, hotels, and etc. Now, lastly, how did the Japanese influence the Filipinos in the aspect of entertainment? During the Japanese occupation, film production in the country was at a standstill and movies were banned. The Filipino were thus entertained by vaudeville, or the stage show, a form of which an entertainment in the Philippines that became popular during the Japanese period.
How did the Japanese influence Filipinos in the aspect of architecture? The Philippines is known for islands and heritage places because of the historic event that happened during the past. The architectural structure during 1945 was more on the Spanish colonial period, but Philippine architecture was also influenced by the Japanese people. Japan also shares their tradition, art, and even help us improve our architecture, even if they brought chaos during the time of our ancestors. Japanese architecture uses resources and produces magnificent buildings, everyday houses, bridges, towers, and gates that still stand today. One of the examples of the magnificent buildings were the temples, assembly halls, and shrines.